we often hear from defenders of the war in the U.S. that Israel is being held to a double standard, that it is carrying out a just war in a responsible way, and that other countries do not receive the same scrutiny for doing the same thing. And, one recent example of this was NYU Professor Scott Galloway, who was on MSNBC, and he was referring to those killed in Afghanistan and Iraq by the United States. And he said,
"We weren't accused of genocide, but Jews are not allowed, and Israel is not allowed to prosecute a war. And they are prosecuting a war more humanely than we have done. The ratio of combatants to civilians is of civilian death to combatant mortality is lower than it was in Mosul, lower than it was in Japan, lower than it was in Germany. So there's just a different standard for Jews in Israel."
Now, to be clear, Scott Galloway is a marketing professor. He's not an expert on war, and I believe he's wrong on the ratio in Gaza being better than the ratio in Mosul. But either way, that's a belief about a double standard at play here that is fairly widespread in the United States. What do you make of it, this idea that there is a double standard for Israel and how it's conducting this war?
I think that's a bit ridiculous. I would counter that argument. And I mean, look, just to dial it back for a second, right? We, the press, should have put and had more scrutiny on, the U.S. for some of the strikes it carried out in Iraq and Afghanistan. The fact that, it wasn't is not because there's a double standard being applied to Israel. It's because the media didn't necessarily, do its job. And there is, and historically has been sort of this culture of, we let people in power get away quite literally with murder. But to go back to, the whole civilian to combatant ratio, I mean, that's just a horrid way to do a calculus. And I do not think it's correct. I think if we want to look at comparisons of Gaza and Mosul, for example, and I'm not a marketing professor, I was actually a journalist who was on the ground in Mosul. I would say that Israel has killed 3 times as many civilians over the course of 7 months than the Mosul offensive did over the course of 18 months. And both of these wars were taking place in highly densely populated urban areas. The other key difference, I think, also in the way that Israel is carrying out its bombing campaign versus, say, the United States, for example, is this idea of, when do you carry out a strike on a target that you've been tracking, right? So we know that Israel tracks its targets, as does the U.S. The U.S., generally speaking, of course, this doesn't happen all the time, but the U.S. will, generally speaking, wait for a target to be in a less densely populated area before carrying out the strike, and or it will use a missile if it is in a very highly populated urban area that will only bring down the building that the targeted individual is in. The Israelis do the exact opposite of that. They track these targets until they get into their homes. And they use 1,000 to 2,000 pound bombs. And I think that's a big difference here that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of or taking into consideration.
Israel is preparing to invade Rafah, which the U.S. government is strenuously objecting to.
We've made clear our views about operations in Rafah that could potentially put more than 1 million innocent people at greater risk. During his call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president again made this clear.
But it looks like it's going to happen anyway. What do you think an invasion of Rafah means for Gaza and this war?
I mean, it's over, right? We're already seeing it now. There's been no humanitarian aid going through Rafah or Kerem Shalom for the last 48 hours. The UN is saying it's going to run out of fuel in the next few hours. I know that my charity, Inada, we've got stuff stuck on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border. It means that more people are going to die of bombs and disease and hunger. It's sort of, it takes up this suffering to a level that I can't quite wrap my mind around at this stage. And, the other issue also, if we're talking, more broadly about, Israel's military offensive into Gaza, something on this scale and this kind of an urban environment has to be planned out. If we look at sort of any other kind of similar battle space, of which there truly are none, but if we look at any that might even remotely, be similar, so that would be something like, Fallujah 2004 or Mosul 2016, there were always routes for civilians to be able to the battle space and actually hit an area where there were no bombs and where humanitarian access was 100% guaranteed. And that doesn't exist here. And that is really making, all the difference. This lack of preparation, this lack of sort of, adding a human component to this bombardment that really does seem designated to inflict punishment on the entire population. I mean, it is unnecessarily cruel. And, I could very easily argue that there are, a number of other military strategies that Israel could have, implemented that would have resulted in the same, end stated goal, the eradication of Hamas, without destroying the entire Gaza Strip.
Right, because that's an argument that you hear a lot from Israel and its supporters, that this was the only way to do this, and if you have a better idea, let's hear it. You're saying that in your experience covering these wars, that there are other ways to have gone about fighting back against Hamas for October 7th.
Of course there are. Of course there are. There is planning that can be put into place to allow humanitarian. Okay, so let's take a real-time example.
Right.
Let's say Israel wants to actually designate Mawasi as one of the safe zones. You then allow enough time for humanitarian organizations to be able to set that up as a safe zone, i.e. bring in the tents you need, bring in the portable toilets you need, establish warehouses closer to this particular area, put in whatever it is that one actually needs to be able to build that. Now, realistically speaking, this is just about impossible in an area like Mawasi because it's sand dunes, but you at the very least allow for, a basic framework to get put into place. Let's even take the scenario right now. You want to invade Rafah and you're going to tell people to go to Khan Yunis, which is all rubble right now. You know what? Hold off for a little bit, bring in a whole bunch of diggers, from Israel, clear a bunch of the rubble out, and at least create a little bit of space for tents. Allow aid organizations to shift their warehouses that are right now in the area where everyone has been told to evacuate from. No one really knows if any damage has been done to the aid warehouses, but allow that to get moved up to, an area like Khan Yunis as well. Allow for basic infrastructure to get put into place before you tell a population, get out of here right now or you're going to die. It's little things like this that can be done along the way. You don't necessarily need to drop a 1,000 to 2,000 pound bomb to get a guy in an apartment building. You
Right.
don't. We've all seen the Israelis use very, very precision missiles and just go into a specific apartment. And it's an impressive thing to watch, the way the missile literally just goes in and hits one apartment.